Very good morning, class 11 students. So here now we have discussed about the exchange of gases. So after exchange of gases, I have taken the topic that is the transportation of gases. Now you have understood that what is external respiration. You have an idea about the internal respiration, means exchange of gases at the alveolar level as well as at the tissue level. So now those gases like oxygen, CO2, these are going to transported to the different areas of in our body. So which what do you think, that they are transported as O2 and CO2 only? No, see, this is not the case. They form a complex, they form the ions. So those things which are going to discuss in our today's lecture. So the first I'm going to talk about the transport of oxygen, and then we will take up the transport of CO2. Whenever we talk about transport of oxygen, oxygen is transported as dissolved form in the plasma, right? Plasma helps in transportation of oxygen in the dissolved form, and maximum of the times that only 1 to 3%, very less percent of oxygen in the dissolved form is transported by the plasma, right? Only 1 to 3%. The maximum amount of oxygen which is transported, that is in the form of oxyhemoglobin. This is a complex which is temporarily formed. It is temporary, as well as it is very short lived complex. So maximum 97 to 90% of oxygen is transported as oxyhemoglobin, means with the help of your hemoglobin. Plasma is only able to transport 1 to 3% of oxygen. Now if for that, it means let's talk about the structure of hemoglobin little bit. Hemoglobin, it contains a protein which is known as the globin. One part of hemoglobin has the protein that is called globin. The other part of hemoglobin is containing iron. It is known as iron containing part, and this iron containing part is having porphyrin ring, which is known as the porphyrin head of also porphyrin head. So iron part is having porphyrin ring. Now this porphyrin ring, it is made up of 4 pyrrole rings, or in few books they always write that the 4 pyrrole molecules. So each porphyrin ring, it is made up of 4 pyrrole rings, and each pyrrole ring, it has one ferrous ion. It has one ferrous ion, and each ferrous binds to one hemoglobin molecule. Don't get confused. One by one we are going to, again I'm going to repeat it. First thing, iron is present here in the form of ferrous. So hemoglobin has two parts. One is the proteinaceous, that is globin, and other is the iron containing part. Iron containing part of hemoglobin has porphyrin ring, which is known as porphyrin head also. It is this head, it is made up of 4 pyrrole rings, and each ring, 4 rings are there, and each ring has one ferrous ions. So it means 4 ferrous ion will be there. These 4, they can bind, each can bind with oxygen. So 4 can bind with 4 oxygen. So if this is your pyrrole ring, 4 pyrrole ring are present, so 4 iron, and these can bind, each ferrous can bind with the oxygen. So 4 oxygen in the hemoglobin molecule. So one hemoglobin, so that is why we always say one hemoglobin can bind, or you can say can carry 4 oxygen molecule, because of these 4 pyrrole ring. What does this ring have? These pyrrole rings, they have ferrous ions, and these ferrous ions, they can bind with oxygen. So oxygen plus hemoglobin, they form a complex which is known as oxyhemoglobin, and this complex is temporary and short lived complex, but maximum 97 to 90% of oxygen is transported in this way, in the oxyhemoglobin way. One hemoglobin can bind with 4 oxygen molecules. But if I change it into the gram, 1 gram of hemoglobin, because whenever you go for your blood test, the values they are giving in the form of grams, right? So 1 gram of hemoglobin can transport 1.34 ml of oxygen. Now your 100 ml of blood, it is in males, it is having 15 gram of hemoglobin, and in the normal, I'm saying healthy normal females, the average is about 12 to 13. Usually females, they have less amount of little bit less amount of hemoglobin as compared to males. In males it is 15, and the what is the volume, that is the 100 ml of blood. So if I ask you that if 1 gram of hemoglobin is can transporting 1.34 ml of oxygen, how much oxygen can be carried by 15 gram of hemoglobin? You can easily answer that if 1 gram of hemoglobin can transport 1.34 ml of oxygen, then 15 gram of hemoglobin can carry 1.34 into 15, 20.1 ml of oxygen. So in this way, in your exam, they can give you 13 also, 13 gram, they can give you 12 gram also, they can give you 11 also. So if you know that 1 gram of hemoglobin transport always 1.34 ml of oxygen, you can calculate for any gram of hemoglobin. The main factor which you need to understand here, that the factors which help in formation of this oxyhemoglobin, what are those factors, what are those points which are regulating or which are affecting the formation of oxyhemoglobin? There should be always high partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolar air. So if in your alveoli high partial pressure is present of oxygen, then it will lead to promote the formation of oxyhemoglobin. So with the high partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, there will be high partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood. So high partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood and high partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, these are the two factors which promote the formation of a complex which is known as oxyhemoglobin. So now, when can you say that this hemoglobin, why it act as a respiratory pigment? Because this hemoglobin is helping in the transportation of gases, in the oxygen transportation. That is why it is known as respiratory pigment. And as you know that 97 to 90% amount of oxygen is transported by the complex which is formed with the oxygen plus hemoglobin. That was about the transportation of oxygen. Now let's talk about the transport of CO2. Usually, where did you find CO2? That is mixed in the blood at the tissue level. So transportation is always at the tissue level if we say about the CO2. That CO2 is transported to the heart first, and then it goes to the lungs, and from lungs it is thrown out in the atmosphere. So this transportation of CO2, it is done by the plasma. It is also transported by plasma, but very less amount. Plasma is going to transport very less amount of CO2, as well as RBC with the hemoglobin. So these are the three main areas which main three components which help in transportation of CO2. 10 ml of blood can transport 3.7 ml of CO2. That is the normal range, that if 10 ml of blood, in 10 ml of blood, that I can transport 3.7 ml of carbon dioxide. Now we will see that how CO2 is transported. In oxygen, we said there is the formation of oxyhemoglobin. So in CO2 transportation, we always discussed three forms in which CO2 is transported. It is never transported as direct CO2. It change into another form. The first form in which CO2 change, that is transported as the carbonic acid through plasma. Plasma transports CO2 as it changes into carbonic acid. So CO2 first change into carbonic acid, then it is transported by the plasma. So CO2 react with water in the presence of enzyme carbonic anhydrase. This reaction when CO2 react with water and form carbonic acid. This is a zinc activated reaction, or you can say this enzyme is zinc and activated enzyme. This carbonic anhydrase, it works in the presence of zinc, and then carbonic acid is formed, which is your H2CO3. Then it enter into plasma, and which help in the transportation of CO2 in the form of carbonic acid. Amount of CO2 which is transported as carbonic acid, that is only 7%. So it means plasma can transport CO2 as the carbonic acid form only 7%. And this fraction is also actually sometime it create a tension, CO2 tension, because this is increasing CO2. So this creates CO2 tension in the blood. But one more thing, I said 10 ml of blood. 10 ml, I said 10 ml of blood can transport 3.7 ml of CO2. So, but out of that 3.7 ml, only 0.3 ml is transported as carbonic acid. Now you can see that how much plasma can transport as the carbonic acid. That is the 0.3 ml. This reaction, CO2 plus water and carbonic acid is formed. This does not happen in the plasma. This reaction takes place in the RBC, which we are going to see in the next step. So the first form was the carbonic acid. Second form in which CO2 is transported, it is the bicarbonates of sodium and potassium. 70% maximum amount of CO2 is transported as the bicarbonates ions, and this reaction starts in RBC. So now let's see that this is our RBC, and outer side is the membrane of RBC, which is known as Donan's membrane. Now what is happening here, that CO2 from tissues, because tissues they are undergoing the metabolic processes, and they are releasing the CO2. This tissue from the CO2 from the tissues, it's entering or diffusing into RBC. This is our RBC. So this CO2 is diffusing into RBC. It is reacting with water in the presence of enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and this enzyme is zinc activated enzyme. So what will be formed? Carbonic acid will be formed. Now this carbonic acid, it will dissociate into, it will break down into H positive and bicarbonate ions. Now these bicarbonate ions, they are formed in RBC. Now these bicarbonate ions, they will diffuse, they will move out in the plasma. How they will diffuse out? How will they diffuse out? That transportation of bicarbonate ions from RBC into the plasma is done with the help of carrier mediated proteins, or this transportation is known as carrier mediated transport. Means for this kind of transportation we need help of carrier proteins, right? Where are these proteins present? These proteins, they are present in Donan's membrane. So these carrier proteins, they are present in Donan's membrane, and these are known as bicarbonate chloride carrier proteins. But here I did not talk about chloride. I only talked about bicarbonate ions. That bicarbonate ions, they are formed and they are releasing out into the plasma. They are diffusing out into the plasma. It means if more and more bicarbonate ions, they will come out, then they will disturb the ionic balance, because these are negative, right? More and more negative ions, they will start accumulating in the plasma. It will disturb its ionic balance. So what do you need? You need something to send inside also. So what is happening here? Chloride ions, they are moving in the in RBC, with the help of these bicarbonate chloride carrier proteins. So what is happening? That HCO3, which is formed in your RBC, that is moving out into the plasma. To maintain the ionic balance, chloride ions, they are pumping into RBCs with the help of bicarbonate chloride carrier proteins. To maintain ionic balance, chloride ions are pumped in. The condition, the point which required to dissociate, because bicarbonate ion form हो गया, कैसे carbonic acid तो बन गया, कैसे टूटता है ये? Whenever there is a low partial pressure of oxygen in the tissue level, when there is low level, that moment H2CO3, it breaks down into H positive and HCO3 negative ions during the presence of low partial pressure of oxygen. Why chloride ions we are sending in? Suppose 100 bicarbonate ions, they are coming out, pumped out. More and more negative charge will be creating outside. Is that kind of optimum condition? No. That to maintain, there is always an ionic balance. If one side there is a high concentration, they will start moving to the other side. So to maintain the balance on both sides in the plasma and RBC, to maintain their ionic balance, chloride ions are pumping into the RBC. And this movement of chloride ion, it is known as chloride shift, because as chloride ions they are moving in, this is known as chloride shift or Hamburger's shift or effect, which is observed in case of RBC and plasma. Whenever there is an exchange of HCO3 negative and chloride between the RBC and plasma. So now what do we have in plasma? In plasma, we have bicarbonate ions. Bicarbonate ions, they are now present in outside in the plasma. They react with sodium, they react with potassium, and they form sodium bicarbonate and potassium bicarbonate. See, these two forms, they are forming outside in the plasma. Because why they cannot be formed inside the RBC? Because your Donan's membrane, it is impermeable to sodium and potassium ions. Donan membrane, it does not allow the entry of sodium and potassium ion. That is why bicarbonate ions, they come out, they are diffused out into the plasma, they react with sodium and form sodium bicarbonate, and then react with potassium, form potassium carbonate ion. So these are the two forms which help in the maximum transportation of CO2 in the form of bicarbonates. It can be sodium or it can be potassium. Whichever is the condition available, they will form the sodium. If sodium is available, they will form sodium carbonate, bicarbonate, and then potassium bicarbonate. The last one in which CO2 is transported, the last form, that is the carb amino hemoglobin. It is very like oxyhemoglobin. It is also temporary and short-lived complex. Only 23% of CO2 is transported as carb amino hemoglobin. What is happening in this? CO2 reacting with the amino group of hemoglobin and forming carb amino hemoglobin. As you just look at the reaction, CO2 carb amino hemoglobin. So CO2 plus your amino group of hemoglobin, they form the complex which is known as your carb amino hemoglobin. This is the third way in which CO2 can be transported, by reacting with the hemoglobin's amino group. So three forms we discussed today in which CO2 is transported. First, as the carbonic acid, that is only 7% is transported. 7% of CO2 is transported as carbonic acid. Then 70% of CO2 is transported as the bicarbonate of sodium and potassium, and 23% of CO2 is transported as the carb amino hemoglobin complex. So this is all about our exchange of gases. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about the regulation of your exchange of gases, as well as there are few disorders which are related with your breathing. So I will meet you in the next lecture.